go. Alright, I want you to have a go at answering these 5 questions first. So question number 1, what are the similarities and differences between mitosis and meiosis? We did this at the end of our last unit. What are the stages of meiosis? What do the terms diploid and haploid mean? And what are the advantages of sexual and asexual reproduction? Okay, let's go through them. So the first one, what are the similarities and differences between meiosis and mitosis? Does anyone have an example of an answer? You gave me one before.
There's 4 cells.
Yep, so one of them makes 4 cells at the end where the other one makes 2. One of them makes cells for reproduction where the other one just replicates cells for the ability of the organism to survive. So did anyone get the second one? No? The third one, diploid and haploid. We talked about this last time. Yeah, diploid's the full set and haploid's half of that.
The full what?
The full set of chromosomes. And then the advantages and disadvantages of sexual and asexual reproduction. What is sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction? Yeah, so sexual requires 2 people, 2 organisms. Asexual only requires the 1. So what's an advantage to not having to find a mate? Yeah, you can do it by yourself whenever and wherever you feel like it. You can just reproduce. You're not dependent on something else. What's a disadvantage of that? Yeah. The environment comes into play. So here you're looking at diversity of genetics. So you guys aren't exactly the same as your parents. You're a cross between your mother and your father. So therefore your genetics aren't identical to what came before you. So you have more variation in your genetic material. So if something is to change or happen in your environment, say a disease comes through, if you've all got exactly the same genetic material and the disease is able to kill one of you, it's probably going to kill a fair few of you. But if you have this variation, you're able to survive it a bit better. Okay, so this one here is mitosis. So it's the division of the nucleus which leads to identical copies. This is the one we did at the end of last term. So you've got your 1 and then it splits and gets you 2 at the end. So you've got your 2 cells at the end here instead of just having 1, but they've got identical genetic information. So they both got the red and the blue in them. Okay, asexual reproduction is the production of new individuals or offspring through mitosis, with each daughter cell receiving a copy of every chromosome of the parent cell. So I was just talking about with the genetically identical information from the predecessing cell. And there's some examples at the bottom there for you. All right, the advantages: no need to find an offspring and for your mating conditions and all that kind of stuff, and you don't need to use resources in producing and releasing the large number of egg and sperm. So this is where we look at things like fish, how they release their eggs into the water and then the male fish release their sperm, and then they're just the happy hopings that the sperm and the egg magically manage to come in contact with each other and that they all get fertilized. Alright, this one here is in your workbook. You need to make sure you have a go at this. It's on page 186 to 188. You need to put, is it unicellular or multicellular? What's the difference in those 2 words?
In biozoe.
No, it's in your Heinemann. What's the difference between unicellular and multicellular?
Unicellular makes 1.
Yeah, unicellular is 1 cell, multicellular is more than 1, so 2 or more. You need to provide me a definition of what this type of reproduction is, and then give me an example of that. So you can open your textbooks to that page and have a go at that. Okay, so binary fission, is it uni or multicellular? Uni. Budding? Both. Fragmentation? Multi. Vegetative reproduction? Multi. And then the parthenogenesis? Alright, what is binary fission?
Meiotic division of units.
Yeah, so it's single cell division, involves mitosis. Can someone give me an example?
Bacteria.
Bacteria. All right, budding is both uni and multi. Can someone give me a definition of budding?
It's similar to the binary fusion.
Yeah.
When it divides, it's unequal.
Yeah. So binary fission and budding are very similar. Binary fission, they divide evenly. Budding is uneven, so you might have one part that is larger than the other. An example of that, starfish. Fragmentation, what is it? Yeah, so the body of that organism breaks off and then regenerates into a whole new organism. An example? Flatworms, starfish, that kind of stuff. Vegetative reproduction.
Hey, the starfish are both budding and fragmentation.
Yeah, it depends.
Depends what type of stuff.
It depends how much of this, because if starfish lose a limb, they grow their limb back.
Yeah.
And then that limb that falls off grows a whole new one. But so it depends on how they're reproducing at that time. Are they reproducing as in like they're doing it themselves, or are they doing forced reproduction where someone's chopped an arm off a starfish? No. No. It's the same as like worms. If you cut the worm cut worms at certain points, you'll get 2 new worms and they won't die. Eventually.
Torture the starfish, start chopping it.
Why? Because it's plants. It's talking about plants in general. And plants generally are multicellular. Alright, what is vegetative reproduction?
Wait, what is it? I don't know.
The second last one.
Separation.
Yep, so one plant to make a new plant.
Rose? Is that a rose?
Yep. Roses, any other examples? Potatoes. Alright, the last one, parthenogenesis. What's that? Okay, so it's like cloning the organism, so that when the egg gets fertilized by an unusual mean. So it's not, for example, like for us, it's not sperm and egg, it would just be the egg, and then the egg kind of self-fertilizing. So you're making a clone of the original. Are there any examples for that one? Lizards and insects, yep. Okay, so here they all are again for you. So you've got your binary fission, which is unicellular. The parent cell divides into the 2 parts, as you can see in the picture to the right. And then you've got your budding at the bottom of that picture, so it's uneven. So in the top one, these 2 cells at the bottom here are the same size, whereas down here, the limb that comes off that whole organism is a lot smaller compared to the rest of the organism. Budding generally is unicellular, but it can, in some rare instances, be multicellular. So if you're answering questions about this in an exam situation, it's more likely that they're going to refer to it as being unicellular than multicellular. You've got fragmentation here and the vegetative reproduction as well for you to read over. And then the parthenogenesis or virgin birth is there as well, which is multicellular. Alright, sexual reproduction. This is a reproduction involving the fusion of the 2 sex cells, the 2 gametes, the egg and the sperm, which are haploid products of meiosis. Haploid meaning half. So each of those reproductive gametes has half of the genetic material, so that when the 2 combine together, you make one full genetic set of information. Is that clear or confusing? Alright, the advantages of sexual reproduction is that genetic diversity that I was talking about before. So I don't have exactly the same genetic information as my parents, so therefore there's a higher chance that I have some kind of a mutation, or that favorable genetic materials are passed across to me to make me less susceptible to certain diseases and certain conditions. And that enables me to survive when my environment around me changes. So say some massive disease comes through, I'm more likely to survive if I've got that change in my genetic material. Whereas if we've all got exactly the same, we're all at a pretty high chance of dying, unless we're one of the very few strong within that species. So your disadvantages, any changes really come at the cost of an organism. So if they're making any changes to their offspring, it's generally through mutation of their own genetic information. So there's a higher chance of the offspring then dying because of those mutations. you've got reproductive behaviors that, instead of what were formerly attracting mates, could now attract predators. You've got competition between males to be the dominant one and to hold their area because they're not relying on anybody else to help them populate the area. And then some of them die, some organisms will die after they reproduce. So once they've made their offspring, that's the end of their life cycle and they die. Remembering that diploid is the full set of chromosomes. So for us in humans, it's the 46, that's our diploid, and then the haploid is the 23. So anytime that you're making an egg or you're making sperm cells, you've got 23 chromosomes in it compared to every other cell in your entire body, which has 46. Remembering that different organisms have different diploid and haploid numbers. Okay, so if you're looking at a different, in your exam, it's never going to give you humans. Okay, very, very, very rarely will they be talking about reproduction and diploid, haploid in terms of humans. They're going to be talking about other animals. So you then need to apply your knowledge. It'll tell you the haploid number of chromosomes in this organism is this number. What would the diploid be? And you'll have to work it out. Okay, so if it gives you the haploid, you have to double it. If it gives you the diploid, you have to halve it to get your haploid. Okay? So you need to be able to interpret that for any number of organisms that they give you. Alright, we just talked about the haploid being the half set. And meiosis, which is your reproductive cell division, so that you end up with your 4 daughter cells at the end. So here, you can see on the right hand side that the colors are kind of all in different spots. So you've got some that are all blue, and then some that have little bits of red, some that are all red, some that are combinations. That's to do with the crossing over of the genetic information. So when the cells are lining up in this in that third picture there, some of the genetic information from one chromosome crosses over to the other, and that helps create that genetic diversity that we're talking about as well. So the information that I have in me isn't 50% my mum and 50% my dad. In some cases, some of the information on my dad's chromosomes would have crossed over to my mum's chromosomes to make it a little bit different. Yes? So that's how that happens. So when my dad is making his sperm cells, when his line up, it's a swapping over of those cells. Sorry, not those cells, the chromosome information. So then I get information from my grandparents on all 4 cases. Alright? Yeah, we talked about that, making the 4 haploids at the end of meiosis, not mitosis. So the 4 haploids are of an even size for the males, so every single sperm that they produce is exactly the same size. For us females, only one of the 4 cells that we produce is the correct size. So we start to, as you get that first division happening, you start to put more of your cytoplasm into the other cells. So one of them will become smaller and the other one becomes a lot bigger. So at the end of our female reproductive getting the egg ready, the ovum ready, the other 3 are going to be too small to be able to sustain life, so we kill them off, and you're only left with the one that would be good enough to reproduce. Okay, because we put all, kind of like putting all of your eggs into one basket, you're going to make this one egg really, really good, so it's going to have the highest chance of sustaining life before it's able to, you know, make the placenta and get its nutrients that way, all that stuff. Alright, so this one here is the human reproductive system. It is a cycle. We cycle through life. This is the hard part. In your exams and stuff, they can often ask you to put the reproductive system in the order that the events would occur. And it's often a multiple choice question. So you need to be able to start at any point. So even if I started at fertilization down here, I need to be able to go to zygote, mitosis, the diploid, meiosis, gametes, and back to fertilization. Or I need to be able to start with meiosis on my egg cells and then get my gametes from there, then fertilize them, then have them in their zygote form where the sperm and the egg are together, and then have them go through mitosis. and then have that diploid cell. So you need to be able to start at any point and recognize when things are out of order. This is really important. This is the hardest part of learning about cycles, is that you can come in at any point. Remembering that we read the arrow from the flat end towards the point. That's telling us the direction that we need to go. Generally, cycles are always going to the right because we read left to right. That's how we read left to right. So quite often they'll go that way, but if they're not being picky enough in terms of the images that they'll use, they can sometimes go to the right, or if they're involving certain number of things having to happen underwater before they come up onto land, they'll often go the other direction because they can't start here, and yeah, it's just how they do it. They're just weird. Okay, we're going to start looking at life cycles, and what we're looking at is the stages of growth to get ready for reproduction. So if we're looking at our life cycle, you've got your baby, your infant, and then you go into your toddler, then you've got young, adult, teenager, adult, elderly, well, middle-aged, elderly, death. That's the planned life cycle. And within that, you've got your offspring that you produce to then go through that cycle again. Okay? You need to be able to do the life cycle for a lot of different organisms. So you need to be able to do it for plants as well as animals. Okay? Quite often it's interpreting a diagram. It will give you a life cycle, and you need to interpret that diagram to answer the questions. So this one here is the life cycle of a frog, and this is what I was talking about them going backwards. Drives me insane. So here we start off with the eggs. That's the first thing that we have, and then they go to their embryo stage. They're then in their tadpole phase. Then their front legs will break through. Then they start pulmonary breathing. What does that mean? Yeah, so they're getting ready to breathe air, so they're no longer going to be relying on gills and getting oxygen out of water. They're going to be able to get it from the air around them, and that's when they get ready to come up onto the ground as a tadpole frog, and then their adult frog. So you need to be thinking of things that might influence this life cycle. So if you're living in an area and you don't have a lot of water, what does that mean for the tadpoles? If there's less water, then that can influence any of these early phases in their life cycle. Yeah, so that means that the water could evaporate while they're a tadpole, and therefore the organism would die because it can't pulmonary breathe yet. It's not ready to go onto land. Particularly if we're looking at the Australian habitat, or if they might even pull some examples from LA over the next couple of years, because they're going through an extreme drought at the moment. If we're looking at drought-ridden areas, which is where we live, that's a big question that they ask. This is why they start looking at that water balance in drought areas and camels and all that kind of stuff. You need to be able to interpret them. So have a look at this fly life cycle. What is it telling us? Yeah, which is? It's telling you the life cycle, but what is it telling you about the fly?
It's going from like a pupa.
So what's the pupa? The egg phase.
It's the pre-egg.
So the pupa is the thing that the one thing
Because we've got eggs over here to the right. So is the pupa the same as an egg?
it's like a baby one. The larva is forming the baby. So it's just a
Well, the eggs will hatch to get your larva, and then there's 3 stages of your larva, and then your larvae are probably going to become your pupa. So the pupa is just the phase before they get their wings and legs. So you just need to be able to interpret these images. They can give you any number of them. And my real suggestion to practice these is that you do a really simple Google search for animal life cycles and plant life cycles. And you spend the time actually reading these diagrams and trying to figure out what information it's going to tell you. Because this picture here would probably come along with a section of text that will give you some information about the fly. So it would probably be telling you things like flies rely on rotting meat products to be able to lay their eggs. And then that's what their larvae are what we refer to as maggots. Okay, so it's probably going to give you some of that information, and then it might ask situations of where would it be, where and when would it be most common for the fly to complete its life cycle. It may even tell you how long the life cycle is and other things that they depend upon. So you need to look at how other things influence that animal's life cycle. So the same thing would happen if we were analyzing our life cycles. If someone was to unfortunately pass away before they've reached an age where they can reproduce, what would their life cycle look like? And what does that mean for the population of an organism? So quite often when humans reproduce, you get the one offspring. That's the most dominant reproductive outcome. Sometimes you get your twins or triplets or those kinds of things, but they're less common. And then it takes a number of years before people then have another offspring. And there's that waiting period between the two. So you need to be thinking about how does this life cycle influence the population of an organism. Like at the moment, are there a lot of flies hanging around? Are there a lot of flies in the middle of winter? No. But there will still be flies. There's just not as many. They're more likely to be around in summer because they're attracted to people leaving their food out. And it's all got things to do with temperature as well. So it's easier for them to regulate their temperature and that kind of stuff in the summer, obviously, than it is in winter. We've got a lot of organisms, like the mosquito life cycle is more dominant in summer because we're more likely to get rain and get shallow puddles in summer. And mosquitoes rely on shallow water, and it has to be stagnant water. So if that water's moving, so if it's like a river or something like that, then they're not going to be able to lay their eggs because their eggs will drown in the water. It has to be stagnant, it has to sit flat and still. So when you've got a lot of puddles that we get after thunderstorms, and sometimes they can take a number of weeks to then evaporate, that's all that it takes for the mosquitoes to lay their eggs and for there to be a whole swarm of baby mosquitoes, which are terrible. So that's why never go near stagnant water, and if you've got a pond, make sure you've got a pump on it. Alright, you've got your fertilization strategies. Here we're looking at the difference between internal fertilization versus external fertilization. What strategy do humans use? Internal fertilization. Fertilization occurs within the organism. External is when they happen outside. So this is what we were talking about with the fish laying their eggs outside in their aquatic environment. And they release a large number of sperm and a large number of eggs to increase the chances of those two coming into contact with each other. That's what they're relying on there. And because you're making a lot of eggs, it requires a lot of energy for that organism. Okay? So, like us females, when that time comes around to release that egg, we generally start to eat some more because we're relying on using a lot of energy to finalize that egg. So you tend to get a bit more hungry. And that's why teenage boys eat all the time. There are a few videos there that you can watch at your own time as well. Alright, so internal, this involves copulation, so the sperm need to be deposited inside the reproductive system of the female, and then the male reproductive cells need to be able to make their way to the female cells. It's mostly found in aquatic mammals, and terrestrial animals means land animals. So why do land animals depend on internal fertilization? Yeah, the male reproductive cells need to have some form of a way to get to the female ones. If we're in an aquatic environment, the male reproductive cells are able to just swim through the water to get to those eggs. But if we're on land, it doesn't have any like real legs to be able to go for a bit of a walk across the land. Not how this process works. So if it's internal, then it's able to use the warmth of that animal's system to keep those cells alive, and then it's also able to use those the fluid within those tracts to be able to get to the female cells. Hermaphrodites, we've spoken about these before, they're the organisms that have both male and female reproductive systems, so they produce both sperm and eggs. As we were talking about before, the advantages and disadvantages to sexual and asexual reproduction. Obviously, if a hermaphrodite self-fertilizes, it loses those advantages, that genetic diversity advantage of sexual reproduction. All right, nutrients, you've got indirect development. So with indirect development, an animal's birth from its is different from its animal form. The embryo hatches from the egg in a larval form. The larvae undergo a drastic metamorphosis, which means change, in order to achieve its adult stage. So a small amount of an egg yolk is produced. Individuals must eat soon after they hatch. So their time being an embryo is quite small. This is the indirect development. So the embryonic stage for our reproductive system is a lot longer, really, but they're relying on what nutrients are already within that cell. So it just eats those nutrients within that yolk. Okay? The parents have no caring role, and some protection may be given in a nest or a cocoon. So indirect development, there's a larval stage, the metamorphosis, and then many insects, there's the intermediate stage, that's that pupation stage. Remember we talked about nominalizing words, so the pupae, the pupation. That's just naming that stage. The pupa stage is pupation. Okay, there's a couple of pictures here that you guys can analyze later for indirect development. And then direct development refers to the process of development in which an animal is born in a smaller version of its adult form. There is no major transition in the form of the animal from infancy to maturity. So the large yolk, so the embryo can develop well and be nearly adult when it hatches. Mammal eggs have little yolk but feed the embryo via the placenta or a special teat or pouch in the case of marsupials. Offspring are born vulnerable and usually require care for further development. And then there's these diagrams here for you guys to have a look at later. The timing, animals which have external fertilization must time their release of reproductive cells so that the egg and sperm are able to meet. This is really important when they're doing that external fertilization, because if they're in the water, they rely on water currents and water temperature. If that temperature of the water isn't good enough, or the current of the water is too strong, then fertilization isn't going to be able to happen. So they need to be very picky with the times that they release their eggs and their sperms. And then you've got seasonal breeders, which breed in conditions which are favorable, and that's triggered by the environment. So you're looking at day length, temperature, and food availability. You can see similar kinds of things, similar kinds of patterns happen with humans, but not quite not quite as much. So there tends to be a little bit of a spike around September, which is when children are conceived around Christmas time. And then there's also a spike around end of October, November, which is to do with Valentine's Day, the wondrous joys of Valentine's Day. And then if you backtrack from your birthday, you can generally find that it tends to lie with other celebrations, such as other siblings' birthdays or your parents' birthdays, just to make your lives a little bit more fun. Alright, you got spontaneous ovulators, release egg during estrus and pheromones signal to the males when the female is in reproductive state. Induced ovulation is stimulated by copulation. Induced means that they're forced to do it. So when the sexual intercourse is happening, that's when they ovulate. So it's triggered by that copulation. Whereas spontaneous ones just release it during estrus. That's what we do. We're just spontaneous. We're not triggered by anything else.